March 3, 1944, East Anglia, England. Lieutenant William Overeat held a pencil over a sheet of paper in his quarters, writing to his beloved in Virginia. His hands shook slightly, not from terror, but from the fatigue of long hours in the air and on duty. The mission ahead was unprecedented. For the first time, pilots were expected to fly a single-seat fighter all the way to Berlin and back. Military planners had long insisted such a flight was beyond the capabilities of existing aircraft, yet the briefing papers demanded it be attempted. Outside the window, the airfield was alive with activity. Technicians worked under the glare of floodlights, attaching unusual cylindrical tanks beneath the wings of Overeat's P-51 Mustang. The tanks, wrapped in what appeared to be brown paper, gave the impression of makeshift packages rather than precision-engineered equipment. Some airmen jokingly referred to them as paper bags. When Overeat expressed doubts about their durability, the crew chief explained that these were laminated paper tanks reinforced with a plastic resin, a design already proven in Britain. "They'll carry enough fuel to get you to Berlin and back," the crew chief assured him. In essence, the innovation of these tanks was about to reshape aerial strategy not through heavier armor or advanced metallurgy, but through ingeniously engineered paper bonded with resin manufactured in repurposed print facilities. Workers who normally produced newspapers were now contributing to the Allied air effort in a revolutionary way. The need for this innovation had become urgent following a disastrous day on October 14, 1943. Known as Black Thursday, the day marked catastrophic losses for the 8th Air Force. Colonel Hubert Zeker observed reports arriving at Halesworth, each one detailing destruction on an industrial scale: 60 B-17 flying fortresses lost, 600 airmen killed, missing or captured. Of 291 B-17 seconds sent to bomb Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, 60 were shot down in combat, and another 17 were damaged beyond repair, a staggering 26% casualty rate for the formation. Without fighter cover, daylight bombing operations over Germany were becoming unsustainable. Technical Sergeant Robert Morgan, a ball turret gunner on a returning B-17, described the attacks to intelligence officers. German fighters remained beyond the range of escorting P-47 Thunderbolts, striking in waves once the bombers turned back. The P-47 seconds, capable of reaching only 375 miles with standard drop tanks, were unable to intercept the attackers. Bombers were effectively sitting ducks for hours at a time, and the Allies realized that extended-range fighter escorts were essential. At Bovington, in a modest office of the 8th Air Force Technical Section, Colonel Cass Howe examined a peculiar solution: fuel tanks crafted from layers of paper laminated with plastic resin. Manufactured by Bowyer Lloyd in London, normally a newsprint supplier, these tanks were the product of months of collaboration between Howe, British engineers, and Colonel Bob Schaefer. While Britain had developed paper tanks due to aluminum shortages, Howe recognized a different tactical advantage. The tanks were substantially lighter than their metal counterparts, weighing approximately 50 pounds empty compared to 150 pounds for traditional aluminum tanks. This reduction directly translated into increased fuel capacity and operational range. The construction process was meticulous. Multiple layers of craft paper were bonded with formaldehyde-based glue formed over wooden molds and reinforced internally with wooden baffles to prevent fuel sloshing. The entire assembly was then coated with fire-resistant lacquer and finished with a thin layer of aluminum paint, giving the tanks a distinctive metallic sheen. The first combat evaluation occurred in February 1944, when P-47 seconds from the 56th Fighter Group flew missions equipped with British-manufactured paper tanks. Major James Goodson led the sortie and later documented flawless performance. The tanks carried sufficient fuel to reach Hanover and return without leaks or failures, extending operational range by 125 miles. This marked only the beginning. By late February 1944, a quiet but decisive transformation was underway within the U.S. Army Air Forces in England. Colonel Donald Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group, made up of the 334th, 335th, and 336th Fighter Squadrons, began receiving an aircraft that would soon redefine The first of these fighters arrived on February 28, and the pace of change was relentless. Pilots who had spent months flying the rugged but fuel-hungry P-47 Thunderbolt were given less than a single day to adapt to an entirely different machine. Among them was Captain Don Gentile, a pilot who would later emerge as one of the most celebrated American aces of the Second World War. When Gentile took his Mustang into combat for the first time, his total experience in the aircraft amounted to just 45 minutes in the air. It was an extraordinary gamble, but the true revolution was not the airplane alone. It was what hung beneath its wings. The turning point came with the introduction of lightweight external fuel tanks made not of metal, but of treated paper. When paired with the Mustang, these disposable tanks fundamentally altered the strategic possibilities of air combat. Each P-51 could carry 2 external paper tanks, each holding 108 US gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. Manufactured in growing numbers at Boart Lloyd facilities in Sittingbourne and Kemsley, these tanks extended the Mustang's effective combat radius to roughly 850 miles. Suddenly, geography itself had changed. Berlin, nearly 580 miles from airfields in East Anglia, was no longer beyond reach. On the morning of March 4, 1944, at RAF Debden, the atmosphere in the briefing room was tense and expectant. As pilots gathered, Intelligence Officer Major John McAlpin stepped forward and drew back the curtain covering the operations map. What was revealed silenced the room. A single red line stretched across Europe, beginning at their base and terminating deep inside Germany at Berlin. For the first time, single-engine fighters were scheduled to escort heavy bombers all the way to the enemy's capital and return with them. The mission would cover approximately 1,100 miles round trip, a distance previously thought impossible for escort fighters. It marked a pivotal moment in the air war and signaled a fundamental shift in the Allied bombing strategy. Decades later, Captain William O'Brien of the 357th Fighter Group recalled the moment vividly during interviews with Air Force historians. He remembered the briefing room falling completely silent, so quiet, he said, that every man seemed to stop breathing until someone softly whistled and said the word no one had expected to hear: Berlin. Outside, the ground crews had been at work since 300 hours. The paper tanks were already being filled, carefully and methodically. These tanks had a limitation. Once fueled, the gasoline would begin slowly degrading the resin binding the paper layers. After about 5 hours, the tank would weaken, but 5 hours was all the mission required. Despite their humble appearance, the engineering behind the paper drop tanks was anything but simple. Each unit was built from 3 primary sections: a nose cone, a cylindrical center body, and a tail cone. The central section consisted of multiple layers of specially treated paper wrapped tightly around a form, while the end caps were constructed by hand using petal-shaped segments known as gauze. Once assembled, the tanks measured approximately 100 inches in length and were pressure tested to 6 pounds per square inch. The tanks were designed to perform under extreme conditions. They functioned reliably from sea level up to 40,000 feet and withstood temperatures ranging from -60 to +120 degrees Fahrenheit. Each held 108 usable gallons of 100-octane aviation fuel, sometimes listed as 110 gallons total capacity. Production of these tanks became a remarkable industrial effort. At Boart Lloyd, many of the workers were women who had previously been employed in the newspaper and printing trades. Additional manufacturing was distributed across smaller workshops and even private homes throughout Britain, creating a decentralized production network capable of meeting the rapidly growing demand. Yet not everyone was convinced. Technical specialists in the United States, often referred to dismissively by airmen as right field experts, dismissed the idea outright. Their reports insisted that paper fuel tanks were impractical, unsafe, and fundamentally incapable of performing their intended role in combat operations. By the time these assessments reached England, reality had already rendered them obsolete. The 8th Air Force had flown thousands of missions using paper drop tanks. More than 15,000 had been deployed without a single failure traced to structural defects or manufacturing flaws. Colonel Hal Blakesley's response to the criticism was straightforward and unwavering. He ignored the doubts, pushed for increased production, and trusted the evidence provided by combat results rather than theoretical objections. Operational success, he believed, spoke louder than any laboratory report. On March 4, 1944, that confidence was validated. P-51 Mustangs, joined by P-47 Thunderbolts, escorted more than 700 heavy bombers on the first fighter-escorted mission to Berlin. At the head of the Mustang formations flew Colonel Blakesley himself. His pre-mission words to his pilots, recorded by intelligence officer Captain John Slater, captured the significance of the moment. That day, paper, fuel, and a single engine fighter combined to change the course. To off-the-air war over Europe. The introduction of paper fuel tanks transformed long-range fighter operations. Pilots were able to reach distant targets and return safely, with the added ability to engage enemy aircraft once their primary mission point was reached. With these tanks, Allied air forces effectively secured aerial supremacy all the way over Berlin. The missions, however, were not without casualties. The 4th Fighter Group suffered the loss of Lieutenant Alan Bante, who was downed by anti-aircraft fire near Brandenburg. Despite these losses, the psychological effect on both sides of the conflict was significant. Luftwaffe pilot Oberleutnant Heinz Knock, serving with Jagdgeschwader 11, noted in his wartime diary the profound shock of witnessing American fighters over Berlin. An outcome that contradicted the intelligence briefings they had received, which had assured them such overflights were impossible. For bomber crews, the presence of P-51 Mustangs above the city was a game-changer. Sergeant Dale Rice, a bull turret gunner with the 100th Bomb Group, recounted during official debriefings the first time he observed the Mustangs at 30,000 feet. The fighters left contrails behind as they flew past, and Rice distinctly noticed the auxiliary tanks mounted under their wings. One Mustang even signaled with a wing wag as it passed overhead. The immediate effect of these long-range escorts was dramatic. By March 6, when bombers returned to Berlin with Mustang cover, Luftwaffe interception attempts had dropped sharply. Major Walter Nowotny, one of Germany's leading aces with 258 confirmed kills, reported to the Luftwaffe High Command that the Americans had effectively neutralized the range limitations, erasing their prior tactical advantage. The production of these paper-drop tanks highlighted both Allied industrial ingenuity and collaborative effort. Bowauto Lloyd, a company responsible for producing roughly 60% of Britain's pre-war newsprint, adapted parts of its Sittingbourne and Kemsley plants to manufacture the tanks. The firm's expertise in paper lamination and access to raw materials made it ideally suited for this purpose. The paper itself came from recycled newspapers and packaging, while the water-resistant resorcinol formaldehyde adhesive was synthesized at Imperial Chemical Industries facilities using resources that did not conflict with other wartime needs. From the collection of raw materials to a completed tank, the entire production cycle required approximately 72 hours. Additional output was achieved through distributed manufacturing, with home-based workshops contributing components. Tanks were packaged in thick brown paper for shipment, maximizing the number that could be carried on transport aircraft compared to metal equivalents. Master Sergeant Donald Manner of the 357th Fighter Group oversaw drop tank logistics at Lyon, maintaining meticulous records. On mission days, his team began work at 2 a.m., unwrapping and inspecting tanks, then attaching them to aircraft using a straightforward mounting system. Tanks were fitted to standard bomb shackles equipped with a quick-release lever. A single cockpit pull could jettison both tanks simultaneously, a critical feature for combat maneuvering. The tanks tapped into the aircraft's existing fuel plumbing, with check valves preventing fuel loss during release. However, the adhesive used had a notable limitation. Exposure to aviation fuel caused it to weaken within hours, making the tanks single-use items that had to be filled immediately prior to takeoff. By May 1944, the effect of long-range fighter coverage was unmistakable in operational data. Before the introduction of P-51 seconds with drop tanks, the 8th Air Force suffered severe losses. In October 1943 alone, the monthly loss rate averaged 76%, with missions such as Black Thursday reaching 26%. Losses. The deployment of long-range escorts led to a dramatic reduction in casualties, bringing overall losses down to between 1.5% and 2.2%, saving thousands of airmen and allowing the strategic bombing campaign to continue with sustainable attrition levels. Technical assessments conducted by Republic aviation engineers revealed that the paper tanks offered additional benefits beyond weight reduction. Their aerodynamic profile created less drag than metal tanks, subtly enhancing aircraft performance and range. In sum, these seemingly simple paper tanks were a critical innovation, a fusion of resourcefulness, industrial collaboration, and tactical foresight that directly altered the air war over Europe and helped secure Allied air dominance. During combat, these auxiliary fuel tanks proved far safer than their metal predecessors. When struck by enemy gunfire, their layered paper and resin body tended to rip open instead of shattering into lethal fragments, significantly reducing the chance of catastrophic explosions. Another unintended advantage emerged after missions were over. Once abandoned in open terrain, the tanks gradually decomposed within a matter of months. Unlike steel drop tanks, which often remained scattered across farmland for decades, posing risks to livestock and agricultural equipment, the paper versions quietly returned to the soil. One of the most detailed first-hand accounts of their operational performance comes from Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, a fighter pilot who would finish the war credited with 24 aerial victories. On March 6, during a long-range escort mission toward Berlin, Meyer flew with two 108-gallon paper drop tanks mounted under his aircraft. According to his official combat report, now preserved in the U.S. National Archives, he departed at 10:45 a.m. and experienced flawless fuel transfer throughout the outbound leg. At 13:47 near the town of Wittenberg, his formation was intercepted by German fighters. Meyer immediately jettisoned the tanks and entered combat. The effect was dramatic. Once relieved of the external weight, his aircraft's responsiveness and speed improved instantly. In the engagement that followed, Meyer destroyed one Focke-Wulf FW-190, inflicted damage on another, and successfully disengaged. He returned safely to base with approximately 45 gallons of fuel remaining. In his assessment, without the additional range provided by the disposable tanks, the mission would have been forced to turn back as early as Brunswick, well short of its objective. The consequences extended far beyond individual dogfights. With the range advantage conferred by these tanks, American fighters were no longer limited to close bomber escort. They could now range freely across German airspace, launching aggressive fighter sweeps that targeted airfields, rail networks, and opportunistic ground targets deep inside the Reich. This shift marked a turning point in aerial strategy. In May 1944, Colonel Hub Zemke, commander of the renowned 56th Fighter Group, conducted a formal tactical review of ongoing air operations. His conclusion was unambiguous. The extended reach made possible by British-developed paper drop tanks had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the air. For the first time, Allied fighters consistently dictated when and where engagements occurred, wresting the initiative away from German defenders. German awareness of this disadvantage is well documented in records captured after the war. A technical intelligence report produced by Messerschmitt AG on May 15, 1944, explicitly noted that Allied forces were employing disposable fuel tanks made using laminated paper reinforced with phenolic resin. German engineers attempted to replicate the concept but were unable to scale production. The failure was not rooted in a lack of engineering understanding. Instead, it exposed deeper structural weaknesses. Within Germany's wartime economy, paper production capacity was insufficient, as most mills had been redirected to manufacturing maps and administrative materials. Resin compounds were already earmarked for essential aircraft components. Most importantly, Germany lacked the decentralized manufacturing network that allowed Allied industry to produce vast quantities of specialized equipment across dispersed facilities, making their supply chain both flexible and resilient under attack. Senior Luftwaffe leadership grasped the strategic implications almost immediately. In post-war interrogations, several high-ranking officers acknowledged that long-range Allied fighters represented a decisive shift in the air war. Although a dramatic quote often attributed to Hermann Goering about the moment he saw enemy fighters over Berlin cannot be conclusively verified in primary documents, his recorded testimony to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey is clear. He stated that the appearance of long-range escort fighters dealt a severe blow to German strategic planning and ranked among the most critical factors leading to defeat. When Allied fighters reached the capital, he admitted the outcome could only be disastrous for Germany. General Adolf Galland echoed this assessment. In his own post-war statements, he explained that American fighters roaming freely across German airspace effectively dismantled the Luftwaffe's defensive doctrine. By early summer 1944, disposable paper drop tanks were no longer experimental equipment. They had become standard issue for Allied fighter units. The logistical advantages were just as significant as the tactical ones. Sergeant James Patterson, a quartermaster stationed at Duxford, kept meticulous supply records showing that paper tanks occupied only a fraction of the shipping volume required for metal versions. When transported flat, they consumed roughly 1/10 the space. A single C-47 transport aircraft could deliver hundreds of paper tanks in one flight, compared to fewer than 40 metal tanks. This efficiency proved vital after the Normandy landings. Forward airfields in France could be resupplied by air even when roads and railways were damaged or congested, allowing fighter units to maintain relentless operational pressure. Although environmental concerns were not part of wartime planning, their effects became apparent in the years that followed. French farmers later reported that discarded metal drop tanks left behind by earlier operations damaged plows, injured cattle, and required prolonged cleanup efforts. By contrast, the paper tanks quietly disappeared, leaving little trace. An accidental benefit of a wartime innovation that reshaped the air war over Europe. During the winter months, paper drop tanks, a key innovation of Allied air operations, often disintegrated when exposed to rain, leaving behind only metal fittings that could be recycled as scrap. One of the rare instances of tank failure occurred on July 18, 1944, involving Captain Donald Bryan of the 352nd Fighter Group. While flying at 25,000 feet above Hanover, his port-side drop tank began leaking, causing him to lose nearly half of its fuel before he could shut it off. Despite this setback, Bryan returned safely, relying on the starboard tank, which still contained enough fuel to complete the mission. This incident highlighted the built-in redundancy of the system, a safeguard that often ensured mission completion even under failure conditions. Throughout 1944, the design of paper tanks underwent continuous refinement. The second-generation models featured enhanced resin formulations, extending the maximum fuel storage duration from 5 hours to 12. This improvement allowed crews to prepare aircraft the night before a sortie and reduced the workload of ground personnel during the critical hours before dawn. Additionally, these tanks were treated to withstand extreme cold, preventing fuel lines from freezing at high altitudes, a common problem during early operations. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, demonstrated the operational transformation enabled by these tanks. Fighter bombers equipped with paper drop tanks could range deep into occupied territory, disrupting German troop movements hundreds of miles from the beaches. Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group exemplified this capability, flying 3 missions that day with paper tanks, providing extended loiter time over the battlefield and ensuring continuous air cover for the invasion forces. The presence of long-range fighters proved critical to the success of Operation Overlord, allowing Allied troops to advance with reduced threat from enemy air attacks. By mid-1944, production of paper drop tanks had reached a significant scale. British manufacturing facilities led by Bowwater Lloyd and supported by auxiliary plants produced thousands of tanks monthly, ensuring that the entire Allied fighter fleet in Northern Europe could be supplied with fresh tanks for each mission. In contrast, metal tanks were constrained by limited aluminum supplies and production capacities, creating a strategic advantage for the lightweight paper design. Combat reports from the period illustrate their effectiveness. Colonel Francis Gabreski, the leading American ace in the European theater with 28 confirmed kills, relied on paper drop tanks during his July 5, 1944 mission. Leading the 61st Fighter Squadron to Magdeburg, he destroyed 3 Messerschmitt 109 seconds after releasing his tanks near Brandenburg. Gabreski's after-action report praised the tank's performance at 30,000 feet, noting reliable release under enemy fire and a measurable improvement in aircraft climb rate once the empty tanks were jettisoned. By September, these long-range escorts had severely degraded the Luftwaffe's day fighter force. General Galland reported to Hitler that Allied fighters were operating across Germany with near impunity, systematically dismantling German air defenses and forcing pilot training onto dispersed airfields. German pilots often had fewer than 50 hours of flight time, in stark contrast to American pilots' 400-hour average. Exceptional long-range missions continued into the fall. First Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group flew a 1,400-mile round trip to Polit near the Polish border on October 7, 1944, carrying 2 108-gallon paper tanks. After completing his escort mission and dropping the tanks, Drew successfully engaged and destroyed 2 advanced German Messerschmitt Me-262 jets, becoming one of the earliest pilots to neutralize the revolutionary jet fighter. The logistical advantages of paper tanks were especially apparent during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Rapidly constructed forward airfields and overstretched supply lines made the lightweight, compact tanks ideal. They could be delivered by small aircraft or even dropped by parachute. Captain Jack Ilfrey of the 20th Fighter Group documented operations on December 23, noting that his squadron flew 3 sorties with freshly mounted tanks, with ground crews able to rearm aircraft in as little as 20 minutes. Post-war interrogations further confirmed their strategic impact. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, a captured German technical intelligence officer, told U.S. investigators that the introduction of paper drop tanks had a more profound effect than the deployment of any new aircraft type. The innovation rendered Germany vulnerable to fighter attacks everywhere, rendering previously central air defense strategies obsolete. Strategic bombing surveys confirmed the shift. In 1943, before widespread long-range escort, German fighter production was actually increasing. By late 1944, however, continuous Allied Mustang operations across German factories caused a 40% drop in fighter output and a 90% reduction in fuel production, grounding many of the aircraft that had been built. Veteran pilots consistently credited paper tanks with enabling operational success. Lieutenant Colonel John Landers of the 78th Fighter Group flew 103 combat missions, often using these tanks, and later told Air Force historians that their simplicity, affordability, and reliability were essential. Without them, long-range escort missions to Berlin would have been impossible, and the Luftwaffe's defeat could not have been ensured. The technological and manufacturing advances developed for paper tanks had lasting consequences. Lamination techniques found civilian and aerospace applications, and quality control standards at Bowwater Lloyd became models for British industry. Workers skilled in precision paper construction later established companies producing aircraft interiors and architectural elements. Major Richard Turner of the 356th Fighter Group reflected in his 1946 memoir that, while the tanks appeared absurd, they were indispensable, completing 89 missions without a single failure. Soviet observers also took note. Colonel Ivan Kajub, a top Soviet ace, tested captured German drop tanks and found American paper tanks superior due to their elegant simplicity rather than technical sophistication. Ultimately, paper drop tanks were more than auxiliary equipment. They were a force multiplier that shaped air operations, redefined long-range fighter capability, and played a pivotal role in the Allied victory over Germany. The surge in Allied production leading up to the final push into Germany highlighted the immense industrial capacity supporting the war effort. Every fighter sortie over German territory could rely on newly issued auxiliary fuel tanks. Maintenance crews stationed at advanced airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands were capable of fully outfitting entire fighter groups within hours, a task that had previously taken days. Lieutenant Robert Powell of the 55th Fighter Group experienced the ultimate test of these paper-based drop tanks on March 24, 1945 during Operation Varsity, the Rhine crossing. He departed at 600 with two 108-gallon paper tanks, flew to the Rhine, and upon encountering German Me-262 jet fighters near Frankfurt, jettisoned the tanks in combat. After 15 minutes of aerial engagement, he returned to a forward landing strip, refueled with fresh paper tanks, and immediately launched on a subsequent mission, demonstrating both the reliability and operational flexibility of the system under combat conditions. The final significant deployment of paper drop tanks in Europe occurred on April 25, 1945, when P-51 Mustangs escorted reconnaissance aircraft to Hitler's mountain headquarters at Berchtesgaden, a mission spanning 1,400 miles round-trip. This operation underscored the full extent of Allied air dominance as American fighters roamed the remotest parts of the Reich without opposition. Colonel Benjamin Davis, Jr., commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, the renowned Tuskegee Airmen, also utilized paper tanks during escort operations from Italy into southern Germany. In his after-action report, dated March 31, 1945, he noted that the 108-gallon tanks enabled uninterrupted escort to Munich and effective engagements with enemy aircraft at altitudes above 30,000 feet. These simple, yet ingeniously engineered tanks extended fighter range, allowing pilots to operate at maximum effectiveness and demonstrating their value in combat. German civilian accounts, preserved in captured diaries and correspondence, highlighted the psychological effect of these missions. Observers were struck by the spectacle of American fighters frequently dropping empty fuel tanks made of paper over towns and parks, a display that conveyed a sense of almost limitless resources. Post-war Pentagon analysis confirmed the strategic significance of the disposable tank program. Beyond the obvious aluminum savings, the initiative reduced shipping demands, streamlined logistics, and minimized ground crew labor, compounding the operational advantages. Perhaps most importantly, extended fighter range significantly lowered bomber loss rates, reducing casualties by an estimated 8,000 airmen between late 1943 and early 1944. Even skeptics recognized the impact. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris of the RAF, initially doubtful of daylight bombing, later acknowledged in his memoirs that American disposable tanks had fundamentally validated the Allied approach to long-range fighter escort. General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, reinforced this assessment, stating in his final report that auxiliary fuel tanks, particularly the British-manufactured paper variety, were the most critical tactical innovation in the European air campaign. By granting the P-51 Mustang unprecedented range, these tanks transformed it from a capable aircraft into a decisive weapon, allowing Allied fighters to escort bombers deep into German territory and neutralize the Luftwaffe, cementing air supremacy essential for victory. The human element of the paper tank story was equally remarkable. At production facilities, workers 70% women operated around the clock to meet demand, fully aware that each tank they assembled could extend the life of a fellow airman. Technically, the tanks were extraordinary. A full 108-gallon unit could withstand 3 times the force of gravity, and empty tanks endured up to 9 Gs. They operated flawlessly across extreme temperatures and altitudes, and fuel flow rates matched internal aircraft systems, ensuring smooth operation during combat. These achievements relied on widely available materials, compressed paper and plastic resin, yet their innovative combination and industrial-scale manufacturing reflected a uniquely Anglo-American ingenuity. Even German engineers, including aircraft designer Willy Messerschmitt, admitted after the war that while they knew auxiliary tanks existed, they could not envision mass-producing disposable units from non-strategic materials. The Allies, in contrast, converted a logistical challenge into a decisive production advantage, influencing military thinking long after the war. The US Air Force, for instance, incorporated long-range escort into doctrine, shaping aircraft design throughout the Cold War. The underlying principle using simple, replaceable components to extend operational capability became standard practice, influencing everything from fuel tanks to weapons pylons. Lieutenant General William Kepner, commanding the 8th Fighter Command, summarized the broader impact in 1946 congressional testimony. Disposable paper tanks secured Allied air superiority over Europe. Without them, bomber losses would have remained unsustainable, fighter operations would have been limited, and major campaigns including D-Day might have faced failure. The environmental legacy of the program was notable yet underappreciated. Around 15,000 paper tanks were dispersed across Europe during the conflict, biodegrading within months. By contrast, metal tanks created long-term hazards requiring cleanup well into the 1,950 seconds. Moreover, the rigorous quality standards developed for paper tank production influenced global manufacturing practices, introducing statistical process control and demonstrating that simple, well-executed solutions could outperform over-engineered designs. The strategic influence extended beyond World War II. During the 1948 Berlin airlift, transport aircraft employed disposable tanks derived from wartime designs to increase range. Similarly, the Korean War saw enhanced versions fitted to F-51 Mustangs operating from Japan. While materials evolved into modern composites, the fundamental concept, lightweight, disposable range extension, remained central to aviation strategy. The final operational use of paper drop tanks in World War II occurred on May 7, 1945, just a day before Victory in Europe Day. On that day, P-51 Mustangs from a 357th Fighter Group conducted their last combat patrol over Czechoslovakia. Lieutenant Robert Foy, undertaking his 89th mission, carried two 108-gallon paper tanks on a sortie to Prague, releasing them over farmland near Plessis. Over the decades, reunions of veterans often featured pilots and ground crews recounting their experiences with these lightweight fuel containers. At the 50th anniversary gathering in 1995 at Duxford, former Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland met American fighter pilots. When asked about the turning point of the aerial conflict, he pointed to a paper tank on display, emphasizing how this seemingly modest device symbolized constant danger, forcing German aircrews to endure unrelenting pressure with no respite or opportunity to recover. Though deceptively simple in appearance, the paper tank reflected an intricate mastery of materials science, aerodynamics, and large-scale production processes. Every unit represented thousands of careful choices, from selecting paper and resin materials to designing lamination, conducting structural tests, and enforcing strict quality control. Its effectiveness depended on flawless execution across all these dimensions, coupled with mass production at a scale never attempted before. Captain Louis Kurtz of the 3rd Air Commando Group, who flew Mustangs in both the European and Pacific theaters, highlighted the versatility of the design. The same paper tanks that performed reliably in the frigid conditions over Europe also functioned in the humid environment of the Pacific, demonstrating engineering that transcended specific combat theaters. The influence of the paper tank extended beyond wartime operations. Phenolic resins developed for their construction later became a cornerstone of early printed circuit boards, while lamination presses used for tank fabrication were adapted to manufacture television cabinets in the 1950 seconds. Workers skilled in precise paper lamination techniques went on to establish firms producing aircraft interior components, furniture, and architectural materials. Wing Commander Peter Brothers, an RAF fighter leader, observed the American approach to aerial logistics with these tanks. He noted that the United States treated the problem pragmatically, turning combat challenges into efficiency exercises, fuel extended through disposable containers with no emphasis on elegance or prestige, just results. British engineers contributed the underlying technology, Americans scaled it, and together they provided escort fighters the extended range needed to protect bombers en route to Berlin. According to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the introduction of 108-gallon laminated paper tanks increased fighter escort range from 475 miles to 850 miles, a 79% improvement that brought virtually all German targets within reach. This expansion of operational range significantly reduced bomber casualties, saving roughly 8,000 aircrew lives, and allowed the Allied strategic bombing campaign to achieve its intended goals. The history of the paper drop tank illustrates a broader lesson in military innovation. Victory often depends not on revolutionary breakthroughs, but on the clever application of straightforward solutions at a massive scale. The collaboration of British paper companies, American fighters, and resin-impregnated paper effectively undermined Luftwaffe air defenses and ensured Allied air superiority. Throughout the war, nearly 15,000 paper tanks were produced. While initially dismissed by some experts as impractical, their operational impact proved decisive. Each tank that performed as designed represented lives preserved, missions completed, and incremental progress toward victory. Bomber formations could finally penetrate enemy defenses, while fighter aircraft gained the endurance to engage adversaries directly at their bases. Air superiority was not won solely by superior aircraft, but by the extended reach enabled by these unassuming yet indispensable fuel containers. The necessity for an alternative to metal tanks, coupled with the escalating losses of bomber crews, sparked the innovation. British material ingenuity and American industrial might converge to create a solution so simple it seemed improbable: paper and phenolic resin, assembled by civilians in factories, providing a decisive edge to the air campaign. When Lieutenant William Overeat flew over Berlin on March 4, 1944, with paper tanks mounted beneath his wings, he carried not only fuel but the cumulative effort of thousands of engineers, factory workers, and technicians. Individuals who would never see combat but whose work proved as critical as any pilot's valor. The story of the paper drop tank endures as a testament to practical innovation, demonstrating that, at times, the most effective solution is not the most complex or technologically advanced, but the one that is achievable, reliable, and scalable when it matters most.